Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got a little bit of a gem for you here today. This is a vintage model from Yamaha that has a bit of nostalgia wrapped around it. It is one of the first speakers that came out with true beryllium drivers, and you can always tell when you see a real beryllium driver, they're going to have this metal mesh, a grill if you will, that's covering the drivers to protect them from someone pushing their finger into it, because you don't want to poke a hole or push on those beryllium drivers. They will shatter, and they do give off some dust material that is a bit toxic. So they're always protected. And so it's a very lightweight material, and it has kind of a specific sound signature, and they were kind of known for that. The model number is the NS-1000M. And again, like I said, these are a pretty known model. I think they sold quite a few of them back in the day. It's the traditional shoebox shape, three-way design. It has a couple of potentiometers on the front here for adjusting some of the levels. It's got a crossover on the binding post cup that is pretty cheesy, and all the inductors that are in this thing are all steel core inductors, so not great. And of course the binding posts are the old push-on style where you had to strip some wire, slide it into the little spring-loaded clips and let go. Definitely some steel parts within this thing. It's bad, it's bad, it's bad. So I know a lot of you are thinking, man, those things were great sounding speakers. Back in the day when I heard these, they were like a new mile marker. And compared to what was available back at that time, maybe they were. But there are some issues with it, and I can't wait for you guys to see what I was able to do with these things, because I think this one is going to be pretty dramatic as far as improvement goes. And let's just go right into the stock measurements and let's look at what we're dealing with. So a customer brought these in. He had them stored for a while, got them back out of storage, wanted to do something with them, but they just didn't sound as good as he would like for them to. There were definitely audible issues with these things, and a trained ear, even not so trained ear, can pick up on the problems pretty easily. Let's look at the on-axis frequency response. And if you look at the scale of it, just plus or minus, it's not that bad in that it stays within a pretty good range. It stays within about 8 dB, and I say 8 dB only because the tweeter's range at the top end just falls off like a rock, and so that's given its plus or minus a little broader range. But through the usable range, it's within a couple of dB. So a lot of people think, hey, it's within 2 dB over a pretty wide range. That's pretty good. But that doesn't really tell the tale. Let's look at the vocal region there on that measurement. Where you look at the 300 to 500 region, that's the heart of the vocal region, and then that octaves right above it, that's where some of your female soprano and altos, they're right up there in that range a little bit, and their harmonics are all the way up to about 1,000. And you'll see it's a pretty humped up area right there. There's an area there that's pretty peaked and it's pretty broad, and then right into the vocal region, down on the lower vocal region, it drops down. So it would definitely give a bright, kind of a thin sound to vocals. That's just the way it is. That's not the worst of it though. If you look at the measurement, you'll see a little peak, which doesn't look bad on the graph, a little peak at about 1900 hertz. And we're going to get back to that in a minute. Tweeter's got a little peak up at the top, and then, like I said, it rolls off quite a bit. That doesn't tell the tale. And if we look at, let's look at the horizontal off axis, and I went in this direction, and it drops off pretty evenly, so no big surprises there, nothing going on there. Let's look at the vertical off axis, and there's some problems in that these drivers are spaced pretty far apart. And what happens when you space them that far apart and you cross them at a high frequency range? As soon as you start moving up or down, the time arrival of one versus the other becomes more drastic because of the spacing, and the higher you cross it, the shorter the wavelengths are, so they easily become out of phase. And if we look at the vertical off axis, you can see it drops out in the crossover point between these two drivers. As you move up just a little bit, it starts dropping out. So take a look at the orange line, that's just 4 inches up, and then the yellow line, that's just 8 inches up. You can see it's already dropping off quite a bit. And the impedance, if we look at the impedance curve, it's a 4 ohm impedance. But let's look at the spectral decay, and here's where we find out a lot about how a speaker is going to sound. You remember that little bump I was talking about back there at 1900 hertz? That's right in the middle of the mid-range's range. And as you can see, there's a lot of ringing right there. That little peak is a long ring, and it's shooting out there in the spectral decay and making itself really obvious. So, what am I going to do with this thing? It definitely has some issues. First thing to do is take this thing out of there and wire the drivers out the back. I reinserted this and just ran the drivers out the side of this thing, taped it all up so it's sealed. So now I've got access to each individual driver, and I took some measurements on these things. Let's take a look. Let's look at the tweeter's frequency response, and then right under it, let's look at the spectral decay. And if you just look at the frequency response, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, oh man, there's a big hump right there at 3K hertz, and there's a dip after it, and then there's a huge dip before it, and then there's a big hump in the response down low. If that tweeter would have just rolled off all the way down to where that lower range is, nice and smooth, it would have been great. It would have been a huge usable range. But as it is, with these huge dips and that big peak at 3K, you really have to get aggressive with the filter and knock all of that out of it, and you can cross it around 3,500 or 3K at the most, but it's taken a lot to get that out of it. Looking at the frequency response of the mid-range driver, let's look at that, and then the spectral decay. You look at the frequency response of the mid, and you think, well, that's not too bad. You know, there's a little bit of a dipped area at 1,500 and a little peak at 1900 hertz there. The rest of it doesn't look that bad. But you look at the spectral decay, and you can see there's that ringing, and it's right in the middle of the range that I have to use this thing. The tweeter will not play down low enough to cross in that region or below that region, so it's going to be in the usable range of that mid. And then let's look at the woofer's response. Let's look at the frequency response and the spectral decay, and yeah, it gets even worse. If you look at the frequency response, you see all those little peaks, and if you look at the spectral decay, you can see that each of those peaks is a bunch of ringing and stored energy. So this thing has a usable range down low, where you can see the spectral decay drops off really cleanly, but above 1,000 hertz, it's completely unusable. So it would have to be crossed off steeply so that all that ringing isn't in the frequency response, and it's going to have a usable frequency range, maybe 600 or 800 hertz and down, and that's it. And it's going to have to be a steep filter to get all of that out of it. So I knew right away this is not going to be easy. There's going to be some compromises here, and I've got a lot of stuff to try and figure out. It took some time. This one I spent all day on, trying different things, different notch filters, different types of notch filters, and trying to get this thing to work, and I ended up with something, and it's not bad. Let's look at the new frequency response with the crossover. Let's look at the tweeter, the mid, the woofer, how they're rolling off into each other, and you'll notice right in the middle there, I suppressed that area just a little bit, right there at the 1800, 1900 hertz region. I pulled as much of that out as I can. That's where that mid is ringing, and I've damped it out with a notch filter and softened it right in that area a little bit, because the ringing is going to add brightness. So you counter that by making it softer. So it'll sound more balanced, even though there's a little bit of a dip there, and I've designed it to be that way. The tweeter would not play any lower, and so I had to figure out a way to cross it to where everything was in phase, and that's a challenge as well. It crossed right at 4 kHz. I couldn't go any lower with that. I just could not get the tweeter to play any lower. The mid I could have pulled back further, but the tweeter would not go any lower. So let's look at some comparisons here. Let's look at the new frequency response and the old frequency response. And one of the things you're going to notice is I brought the sensitivity down quite a bit. Now, the reason the sensitivity is brought down is I'm trying to notch that ringing out of the mid-range. And when I do that, it brings the overall level down a little bit with it. So the tweeter has a little more of an aggressive set of resistors on it to bring it down. And I bypassed those resistors with a cap and with a coil to where it lifted the top end a little bit. If you look at the original measurements, you'll see the top end is rolling off a little more aggressively. I was able to keep it up a little higher. I brought it up about 3 dB at the top from where it was in the beginning, and that's basically because I'm bringing everything else down, and I'm trying to leave that top end where it is. Another thing, when I brought that sensitivity down, I used a pretty large coil on the woofer and basically just folded the response of that woofer down to where it had a nice, let's say it'd be this way, the way you guys are looking at it. The woofer's response was pulled down and rolled into that mid, and what that did was, the way it was before, where it was 7 to 8 dB down, is now the new 3 dB down point. So what we're gaining out of that by giving up sensitivity, we're not giving up sensitivity where the woofer was naturally rolling off in the sealed box. It was rolling off at the bottom end, so this would be the bottom end like this. And what I've done is I've brought everything else down like this. So in a sense, it plays down a lot lower than it did without it actually even changing the bottom end. Everything else is brought down, and the very bottom end was left intact. So we're going to have a lot better bass response. Also, today, amplifiers have power. You can get inexpensive, high-powered amplifiers. So the fact that this sensitivity is right at 86 dB, it's not that big of a deal. Back in its day, higher-powered amplifiers cost more money. That's just a simple fact. That's the way it was. Today, it's just not. There's good quality Class D amps out there that are 300 or 400 watts, and it costs no more to build that than to build a version of it that's 100 watts. So there's power available out there now, and a lot of these amplifiers have power. Let's look at the new vertical off axis, and what I did was there's a vertical off axis going up and there's a vertical off axis going down. So I knew that these were going to be a problem, the spacing and the high frequency response I was crossing to. So I had to calculate, or not calculate, I had to design a crossover that would keep these drivers in phase over a wide range. What that means is I want it to be in phase to where if you move up or down, you're still within a range where the drivers are in phase. I didn't want it to be like this, to where they're in phase here, and if you moved up, they're already moving out of phase, or to where the phase is on axis up here, and if you move down a little, you'd be out of phase. I wanted it to be centered on the listening area. So I was able to come up with something that kept them in phase over a pretty wide range. Then let's look at the vertical off axis going down. You can see you've got to get down to the woofer level at 1 meter, or up above the tweeter level 12 inches or more, for the off axis responses to start causing the comb filtering between these two drivers. So you can stay within this big range and it's still pretty good. Looking at the horizontal off axis now, it drops off again nice and smooth, no issues there in the off axis and the horizontal. Let's do a comparison though in the impedance. Let's look at the old impedance and the new impedance, and you can see it's very balanced, and it's more of an 8 ohm load all the way across, so it's a little easier to drive than it was before. And then here's the real telltale. Let's look at the old spectral decay and the new spectral decay, and you'll notice it's a lot cleaner, and there's still a little bit of ringing going on right there in that mid-range, right at 18 to 1900 hertz, but I've softened it quite a bit. I've knocked several dB out of it right there, and up in the tweeters range as well. Everything is cleaner. Down in the woofers range, everything's dropping off a little cleaner. It's a little smoother, a little faster decay. Again, couldn't fix all of it, but I fixed it a lot. So overall, the balance is going to be better, less ringing, better vertical dispersion over a wider range, and an easier load for the amplifier to drive. So we're getting bonus hits here. We're getting improvements in multiple areas. And then the area of real improvement, the quality of the crossover parts. Man, these parts, oh, they were really poor. We've got all air core inductors except for the first inductor that goes on the woofer, which is a 10 millihenry, which is a big coil. I'm going to do a laminated I-core on that one, followed by an air core. The caps are all poly caps. A lot of the caps are bypassed with small bypass caps. And we did kind of an inexpensive, using all JB poly caps option. And then we did an option where you could add sonic caps to the tweeter circuit if you want to take some of those detail levels up another notch. And here's what it came to. Now this is all new parts, all good quality parts, with tube connectors to replace these things. And I would recommend cutting a sheet of MDF that fits this hole, a square piece of MDF, replacing this whole thing with that new piece of MDF. Use this as a guide and mark where the screw holes are, and you can screw that new piece of MDF straight onto where that old one was, and then drill your holes straight through it for the tube connectors, and just do away with this whole thing altogether. All new internal wiring, your solder, your heat shrink, and 3 sheets of no-res. And the no-res will do away with a little bit of the cabinet resonances. This one just had one brace going through it. It's a pretty good sized box. The no-res is going to help that a little bit as well. Tighten up that bass response, give it a better sound, a cleaner vocal. All that stuff's going to be big improvements. So the whole kit, everything together, $799 for everything. And one of the reasons it's a little pricey, it's a lot of parts. When you've got drivers that are not well behaved and you have to put higher order filters on them. There's a third order filter here, third order filter here, and there's a notch filter on this, plus a third order filter on the top and first order filter on the bottom. So it made the slopes match. So electrically they may be not the same slopes, but acoustically they are, and electrically these drivers are in phase, and acoustically the whole thing is in phase really well. So I would have told the engineers, go back to the drawing board and get me a mid that doesn't have a bunch of ringing in it. Get me a tweeter that has a smooth response. Let's push those crossover points down a little lower. Let's get these drivers closer together so they don't have lobbing issues because of the spacing. There's a lot of things that should have took place in this thing that just didn't. But what we've done here is going to fix it to a huge degree. Now, if you want sonic caps in the tweeter circuit, it bumps the overall total to $1,015. I know that kind of seems like a lot, but to restore a vintage speaker like this, that has this much nostalgia centered around it, and to bring it up to modern performance levels, it's going to rival a lot of newer model speakers. It's going to be a fun speaker to listen to. It's going to have great bass response. It's going to be a speaker that you can throw anything at and have a lot of fun with. And it'll be a fun project. And there's plenty of space in this box to mount all those crossover parts. If you have some questions on it, post them down below. If you order the kit, if you need a little help with it, we're here to walk you through any aspect of it and help you along the way. And for a lot of you guys, this is going to be a fun project that'll really restore a vintage speaker to levels way beyond it ever had to begin with. If you thought these sounded great before, you have never heard them, because this is going to open these things up a lot. All right, that's it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please hit the subscribe button down below, and hopefully you'll see me again in the next one. See you guys.